So welcome to episode 13 of Unplanned with Phil Bland, and I'm super lucky to have Patrick Bosworth with me today, and we're going to talk about, well, his business journey and going from politics into building his own really successful cloud service solution for the hospitality industry. So Patrick, thanks for being with me.
Thank you for having me.
We're live. Yeah, I guess let me just deal with this. How are you getting on? How's the lockdown experience? How's isolation? I saw some of your videos on Instagram walking around, and all the streets are empty. How does it feel at the moment? How's it been for you?
I mean, it varies day by day, to be honest. In general, I've enjoyed the sort of forced break. I mean, I've been traveling a few hundred days a year for the last 4 or 5 years. And I was surprised at how welcome this would be, just from a personal perspective. I mean, I was also sick for part of it, so that was tough. But then that's actually what kind of forced me to slow down and not just keep, working long days from quarantine.
Yeah, I saw that you had it. How was it? I saw some of your posts about kind of the mental experience of getting through it as well as like the physical. So do you want to talk a bit about that?
Sure. So, I mean, the illness itself was really bad for about 5 days. And I would say that there was about a 12-hour period where I was having what amounted to a panic attack, I would say, because, it was just getting worse and worse. And so, I thought that I was likely on my way to the hospital, but I was able to calm myself down and take care of myself. And I was, a lucky one who didn't end up needing to go to the hospital. I think I did some things to affect my luck in that regard, but I also just think that, how your immune system responds and how the virus goes is to also some extent out of your control. And so, but there was about 5 days where I was pretty sick, and then the breathing issues continued for about another 4 weeks.
Wow, but you're feeling better now?
I am fully recovered.
Awesome. Yeah, it's been a strange slowing down experience, and everyone's kind of dealing with it in different ways, either slowing down or adapting or trying something new, like I'm doing with this show. So it's just, yeah, it's kind of cool in some ways. I mean, it's obviously super scary for, health reasons, people that you love, but yeah, it's a weird time. Yep. So I guess I wanted to talk to you specifically because we met when we were in New York, and that was quite an eventful experience. My friend Brian was having a stag do there, and I remember I turned up with an ex-girlfriend, and we just expected to be going for brunch that day, and I ended up going on a helicopter trip with Patrick to the Hamptons and back that day. So yeah, it was some ride. But yeah, I've kind of followed Patrick for a while, and all the stuff that he's done with his company has been incredible. So I just kind of wanted to dig in first of all on kind of some of the background. So a lot of the time when people are successful entrepreneurially, it's because they either have just an entrepreneurial gene where they were always destined to build their own companies, or they just find a problem that they particularly want to solve. So as a kid, what was your experience? Were you a studier, or were you out there starting businesses? What was it like?
I don't know what I was destined to do. I kind of moved from thing to thing. I mean, I definitely got into business pretty young, in the sense that I think when I was 12, I started doing a paper route, which is kind of a job that I think no longer exists in most places, at least not for children. And, I don't consider that particularly entrepreneurial, but I was in charge of all of the sort of sales and collections and obviously delivery in my territory, and was quite successful at that. Started with, I think, 100 paper route and ended with a 1,200 paper route where I was getting up at 3:30 in the morning every day.
Wow.
7 days a week, and making, I think, something like $40,000 a year.
Wow.
as a early teen. So, and then I've always been starting things. They often weren't businesses though. Like I was starting student clubs. I helped start a nonprofit when I was a teenager. I did a lot of different startup sort of things, but it wasn't until 10 years ago that I did my first sort of business oriented startup, which was a consulting company that we then shut down to start the technology business. And so I feel like I've always been creating things.
Mm-hmm.
And I studied acting for a while and was always interested in, creating new pieces of work and things like that. But it wasn't until my 30s that I really became an entrepreneur per se.
And do you think that some of that is to do with kind of traditional paths that people are kind of funneled down, and in some ways you could be curious when you're younger trying all these different things, but then you almost feel like there's I know I kind of like looking at your background, it's like you went down kind of traditional routes of management executive type paths that would lead into like successful careers in companies, and not necessarily everyone that follows those paths ends up starting their own company. So do you think that was, you had almost suppressed some of those entrepreneurial aspects of your character for a while?
Maybe. I think I was trying to be an entrepreneur within big organizations for a while. And so, and to some extent, oddly enough, I was able to have an opportunity to do that when I worked in the government. So, from my earliest days in the government, I kept wanting to really be able to take ownership of something and make real progress. And initially I thought that would be to try to be at the White House or to be directly on the staff of the Secretary of Labor, where I was working eventually. And I learned pretty quick that they weren't going to allow a 23-year-old with no real experience or expertise to have, significant influence, at that level. And I was looking for a mentor, and I was looking for a place where I could really dig in. And I think I was fortunate, and I think that I made some good choices as well, to end up in a very small, obscure agency that had largely never really met its mandate from a statute that was passed in 1959 that had largely been forgotten. And because it was this little corner of the government, it actually gave me the ability to do real work. So we published a new regulation, we staffed up the agency, we did a number of things where I was able to have a tremendous amount of flexibility and honestly pretty entrepreneurial type venture of taking a statute that had been championed by Robert Kennedy in the 50s as part of an effort to clean up organized crime from labor unions and to eliminate embezzlement of union funds. And then, 50 years later, well, not quite 50 at that point, 40 something years later, to have the opportunity to then really fulfill its mandate for the first time was quite fast paced. And, we were sued. I had to travel around the United States, training unions on how to comply. It was a really intense experience, very different than I think most people end up having in the government, where they experience it being very slow moving and bureaucratic. There was some of those hurdles or some of those things to overcome, but I was also very lucky that Secretary Chow was unusually supportive. I think she believed in what we were trying to do. Obviously was never going to rise up to the top of, things that, are the most important things going on in the country. But I think she gave us the cover we needed to actually be able to get some stuff done. And I'm really proud of what we were actually able to accomplish in those days. And then the WIN organization was similar. We kind of created this sort of startup organization within the company. We were pitching to spin it off as a separate company. We had all these, different ideas. And I think probably correctly, the WIN Resorts organization concluded, we don't want to be a software company. We don't want to be a consultancy. We don't, it's not our business to spin out companies and invest in them and so forth. And so then it became a natural thing to
And just for
rotate
everyone,
out.
kind of listening, so what was that? Yeah, what was that transition like? I understood you were in the government, obviously, like getting a lot of like ownership and responsibility for, you know, affecting change. Why the pivot into the hospitality industry and into more kind of commercial areas? What kind of drew you to that?
Well, so when I was studying acting in undergrad, and then eventually kind of dropped out of undergrad for a while, and I was the proverbial starving artist, I ended up working in hotels and restaurants to support myself, and I actually really fell in love with the industry. When I was in the government, to mention Secretary Chow again, she became a real mentor of mine. She's a graduate of Harvard Business School. The President Bush was also a graduate of Harvard Business School. And, I was getting to be into my late 20s. That's usually the window at which you go get an MBA if you haven't gotten one already. And she recommended that if I didn't go soon, I would probably never go to get an MBA. And having gone from the arts into nonprofits, into government, there wasn't a clear trajectory of how I would get into business. And the MBA is kind of a classic way to transition from, one field to another. And I knew that at some point I wanted to, work in the private sector. And, with her writing a letter of recommendation, with a pretty strong record, I felt like to support my candidacy.
Yep.
And a pretty unique background where I'm not, yet another banker or consultant applying to business school, but I'm actually, have some, diverse kind of experience. My first time in my life being a diversity candidate, but and so it just felt like the right window of time to really look at getting an MBA, and with their help, I was able to get into Harvard Business School. And then my intention from day one really was to use the MBA to transition into the hospitality industry, because I just felt like it was really in my blood. And from what I was learning, it was an industry that didn't have a whole lot of MBAs working in it. So I wouldn't be, one of 1,000 MBAs coming into most of those companies. And in fact, I think in the Wynn Resorts organization, even going back to their Mirage Resorts days, I think I was the first, top MBA, student that they'd ever hired. Not that I'm a top student, but from a top school. And and so I think it did present an opportunity to come in with a unique perspective and skill set. It also meant that they didn't really know what to do with me, because the pay scales and career trajectories and things like that are very much based on, long careers, paying your dues and so forth. And so I think that was part of the other, issue I had staying there long-term, is my business partner at Duetto and we were eager to make huge progress. And he had also come out of a master's program at Cornell University. And, there was a little bit of a culture clash there in terms of, how you structure a career in the casino resort or hotel industry, versus what our interests were, to be able to, make real change as quickly as possible.
And what did you think about, how did you think about security versus taking risks at that point? A lot of people that might be listening to this are in secure jobs, and they feel like they're on a career path, they're getting responsibilities and things. Like, when you were deciding whether you guys wanted to go out on your own and do Duetto after a few years of professional experience, I guess, how did you think about making that decision?
I would love to say that it was really well reasoned. I would say that it was much more sort of gut and instinct than it was a balancing of the different risks and rewards and so forth. When I think about it in retrospect, I think that people generally overestimate the risk. I think that it seems more scary than it probably is. I think that, there are just bad things that randomly happen to people sometimes. So obviously, you want your finances to be stable in case you have a truly major health, problem or something like that. But in general, someone who is hardworking, kind to people, and competent, you're going to find work. Very few people that, keep a good attitude, are humble, work hard, and are intelligent, are starving on the street, so to speak, or not able to support their families. Now, that being said, I went through a much harder period than I anticipated. The process of starting the consulting company had some pretty astoundingly lean months that I just did not expect as a, minted Harvard MBA. I didn't expect to have the financial difficulties that we actually ended up having. That being said, I never really doubted that the experience I was generating from being forced to actually start something and run sales, marketing, finance, accounting, legal, operations, the whole gambit, even at a really small scale, I never doubted that that experience would be valuable. And that if at any point I wanted to pull the ripcord and go back into corporate America, I always assumed that there would be an opportunity to do so. And I think that I was right about that. And so a lot of my friends who have considered entrepreneurial ventures, I generally encourage them just to go for it. And in very few cases, even when the company failed, in very few cases was it not a very good decision for them personally, including financially, because of what I'm talking about. I mean, I think that experience, the networking you do, the perspective that you get, your credibility for all new opportunities that will, come your way. Now, whether or not you can go back to working for somebody else and, taking a corporate job, I think is an open question, because it's a bit hard, I think, probably to go back. I think I would be challenged to now go back to work for some Fortune, 100 company. But if I needed to, I know that would be available to me, I think.
Yeah, I heard a good expression, which is like, you're never really losing. You're either winning or you're learning. And so if you just have that mindset, even the failures or presumed failures actually are kind of learnings that you can take onto the next one. It's often easier to start something when you're younger as well, because, given that you'd started an entrepreneurial thing in your 30s, it's kind of like at that stage in life, people are expected, or societal norms, that they're starting to build up certain, responsibilities. And so it's often harder to throw caution to the wind. So if you could, you can't go back and it's retrospect, but would you have just started earlier, or, and how was that experience of, changing your lifestyle, that you'd built up over the 30s, going into lean startup mode? How did that feel?
Well, so I think there is a distinction between consumer startups and sort of B2B type startups. Founders do tend to be a bit older in most B2B startups. At least that's the data I've seen, which is several years old. I assume it's still true. And the ones that get funded and are successful tend to have older co-founders, largely because it actually takes some time in your career to, understand how a sector works, and how to create something that will be of value to those companies. And so my experience at WinResource, I think, was actually essential to have been able to learn enough about the real problems that needed to be solved. And that if I had attempted it earlier, so let's just say that I had gone to WinResource right out of undergrad instead of into the government, I still don't know that I would have gotten the experience in my 20s, because I wouldn't have had the MBA. I wouldn't have, had the, bald head and, other things for people to start to trust you with responsibility within a real, company of scale. And so, and Marco was the same thing. He'd had his whole career had been in the hotel industry before going to Cornell for his MBA or for his MMH, and then worked at Win for a number of years. And so to some extent, I just think that there would not have been an easy way to accelerate what I chose to do. Now, could I have gone into some startup that didn't could I have launched some entrepreneurial venture that that didn't require that sort of deep domain expertise? Potentially. I think I certainly would have made more money if I had not done, 4.5 years in government, but I also wouldn't have traded, the opportunity to serve and do those things. And I actually think that even that period was a great preparatory period for things I've done later. I think having an appreciation for how the government works and, experiencing politics and so forth, shaped me just like being in the arts did. And so each of these different pretty meandering journeys that I've been on that seem very unrelated and for the most part are unrelated, each has played a part in kind of preparing me to be an entrepreneur. So then in terms of what somebody in their 30s, at least what the perception is in terms of the trade-offs and the risk, I certainly had that. I had 2 children, including, well, I had one when we started the consulting company, and then I had a, under 1-year-old when we started the tech company. And so that was a real struggle. And frankly, it was a real struggle in my marriage, and exacerbated the financial stress. I don't regret any of those decisions, but it was not easy. I mean, it was one of the hardest periods in my life, and of, wondering whether or not I'd, in a few moments anyway, not as a general rule, but in a few moments wondering whether or not I just, driven us off a cliff. But again, I did come back to a fundamental belief that, if I needed to, I could, figure out how to go back into a normal job and make money. But that faith would have been tested at some point. So, I don't have any real magic formula for that. I think a lot of people just choose to make the leap and then you figure it out.
Nice. Yeah. It reminds me of, I think a Steve Jobs quote where you can't join the dots looking forward, but you can kind of join them in retrospect. And it sounds like some of those disparate experiences, while a lot of people would look at them and think, how do they all work together? Then it's all kind of pulled together, and founding a company is helping as skill sets that have helped you on that journey.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that, I do respect people that take it on, particularly if they don't have deep financial resources. I didn't. I had a bunch of student loan debt and no support from family or anything, not out of malice, but just the money isn't there. So, if you look at the statistics around people that successfully start businesses, many of them come from means. And there's if you don't have to pay a mortgage, if you do have, some sort of financial stability that comes from family or earlier career, I do see how that helps. That being said, I would hope that people wouldn't be discouraged, even if their finances are more tight, because I think you can make it work.
Yeah. And, there's also a kind of reverse of that, where people that come from maybe less means are maybe more hungry to, start something. Whereas,
Absolutely.
if it's quite often, it's not that common for people with, a great job to quit that job and start something because life's fine, They don't need, so
there's challenges on both sides. That's true.
So when you and Marco were working at Win, and you guys kind of came from similar MBA backgrounds, how did you both, together, did you come together and find like the problem that you wanted to solve? How did you guys make that decision collectively to start a new venture?
Really, credit goes to Marco for that. He had spent his career developing a thesis for how hotels and casino resorts could much more effectively price and distribute their rooms. And he came to Win to learn the last things he needed to learn. He started within the technology group because he felt like that he needed to round out his experience with implementing and developing custom technology. And then once he'd learned what he needed to learn there, he really wanted to come back onto the business side and create something. He was looking for someone to run revenue management and analytics. And his preference was to find somebody who was smart enough to be taught, but was completely clueless, who wouldn't come with any bad habits or, views on how things should be done. I was in a rotational management program that I'd kind of been pulled out of to do some analytics for the president of the company. I got introduced to Marco, and he thought I was just naive enough to be able to be molded into his vision for what needed to be done, and that's what he did. So virtually everything I learned from him. Now, I think at that point, it was hard for Marco to think about starting a company. He was here on an H-1B. He didn't have his green card yet. I started to be the one really pushing that we should get out a win and start our own thing. And to his credit, as soon as the green card was completed, it didn't take much convincing further, to say, look, let's get out of this big company life and do our own thing. And so we ended up leaving Win within the same week. And so, we were a real team from the beginning, but I would say the vision of the problem to solve was 100% his. And then, with some nudging for me to get out on our own and try to create something rather than going to another company. Because we were starting to realize that was not going to happen at Win for a lot of reasons that's probably not worth getting into. And so initially we were thinking, what other company in our industry could we switch to that would hire both of us and take the foundation we built at Win, but then actually really be able to implement it somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad that we didn't continue down that path to go work for another big company in the industry and instead create our own.
And I guess, and then when I was looking at your background, I was thinking you'd made that jump, but then a lot of people that start technology companies, it's you have to think about the technology solution, but also and product development, but also think about like cash flow and making sure that you've got money coming in. So was that like a decision early on that you wanted to start the consulting business to make sure that there was a flow of cash, but then you had this longer term vision for building the platform solution for hotels? Was that like a strategy that you employed?
No. We keep being tempted to tell the story that way because it really makes sense that this was kind of an incubator and you tested and you get cash flow and you test and build a hypothesis and then launch the software, but it didn't actually work that way. Marco first started by creating an Excel spreadsheet, and that did very manually, although with fancy macros. We called it a fancy Excel spreadsheet, using Solver and using, a little back-end server, and, it was pretty fancy. And we started to sell it as a real product, in addition to our services. And that, I think, was a light bulb going off for both of us, that we were competing successfully against existing software companies with an Excel spreadsheet. And instead of them paying us for our hourly time or for a project, they were actually paying us a license, a subscription, to have access to an Excel spreadsheet. And so then that was kind of like, well, we hear that the software business is a pretty good business to be in. And we were learning the hard way that scaling a consulting business is incredibly difficult. Obviously, it's labor intensive.
Charging hours,
and
number of people.
It's feast or famine. So we'd have like 3 clients all at once, and we'd be working 20-hour days, and then we'd go 6 months without a client. And, so whereas software felt much smoother journey, although I'm not sure if that's true, but it seemed that way from the outside. And so then a business school classmate of mine, a section mate, who I went to for advice, he said, you should absolutely find a technical co-founder. You need a technical co-founder. And you should absolutely raise money and start a hotel software company. And he was willing to help. And so he introduced us to the CTO of Salesforce. His wife used to work with Craig Weissman. Craig was leaving Salesforce.com. He had IPO'd 2 successful tech giants. He wanted to found his own business, was an entrepreneur in residence, or just starting to be an entrepreneur in residence at Benchmark Capital. And, you know, it all just, I mean, it took a year. So it's not like it happened overnight, but through a year of networking and with Dan Skolnick's help and meeting Craig, we were able to figure it out. And so then from the moment Craig Weissman joined, and he's, you know, almost certainly, particularly, you know, coming out of Salesforce, one of the top 10 CTOs of any, you know, software business, because Salesforce is a pretty impressive one. Raising money became trivially easy. We went from grinding it out, getting in like insultingly low valuations with terrible terms, to overnight becoming kind of a Silicon Valley darling with multiple term sheets, dozens of firms being interested, valuations that were 5 times higher than they were the week before. I mean, it's really hard to overstate how important Craig joining was. And then there was no more kind of risks on the cash flow side or famine. And to some extent, you know, looking back on it, I actually think that I wish we'd raised a little less money. Because, you know, we raised a couple million in April of 2012. We raised what, 8 million more in December of that same year. Because we were in a big darn hurry to just get out to market, build the engineering org, build the sales org, and conquer the world. I wonder whether or not having access to capital, you know, as quickly and at the levels we did, might have actually harmed us a little bit, because I think that if we had stayed scrappier for a bit longer and zeroed in a bit more on precisely where the product market fit would be, that we could have maybe even moved faster and raised less money. But we've had a good journey, and so I don't want to, you know, I don't want to play Monday morning quarterback too much. But, you know, at this point, we've raised $140 million, and so when you get on that treadmill of creating large teams and burning cash, you know, burning a couple million a month, it's hard to get off that. And so now the company.
And what kind of, sorry, on your on the Series D, what kind of valuation was that at?
A $240 million post.
Right. And then, wow, yeah, it's a lot. It seemed, you know, it's kind of hard to comprehend, but it's just an incredible kind of journey to go on. I get, like, how do you think about you guys you kind of had an idea of what you wanted to do, and then you just wanted to get it out there. But how were some of these conversations around control of the company in the early stages, with kind of, you know, sharing equity and things like that? Were there struggles at that point, or you just thought, well, you know, because a lot of people can get kind of defensive in these discussions about, you know, they want to hold all of the company, but that can also be a detriment to them because it doesn't actually allow them to scale. So how did you think about those in the early days?
I didn't think as deeply as perhaps I should have. I do agree with the overall premise that I'd rather own less of something big than all of nothing. And I do think that raising capital and having deep-pocketed institutional investors has tremendous advantages. And to the credit, I think, of the VCs that invested in our, you know, first 4 rounds, you know, they don't act like they own the company, and they don't take a controlling stake. You know, each investor would come in, you know, at generally like 15 to 20% ownership. And they tend to be deferential. Now, they also give strong advice. And, you know, over time, I learned to appreciate that their advice is to turn you into the average company. Because, you know, they're just going to reflect kind of the median of what they've seen be most successful. And so learning how to manage those relationships and articulate in those cases where you choose to do something different, why? But then also learn that you don't always have to do everything different. That it is possible to go ahead and learn from what's worked and not feel like you need to be reinventing, the way, companies are structured and their processes and accountability and all these sorts of things. And so I think there is that give and take. Later I would say, as we raised the Series D and so forth, I would say that's when the chafing became a bit more, when investors started owning, well more than half of the company, and bringing in an investor that just has a bit more of a control mindset from a private equity background. And I don't intend for this to be a criticism of them by any means. I don't think they're bad people, so it's not a horror story. But when you do start to raise growth rounds from investors that do a lot of control investing, the tone does change. And so, it's been a learning process all the way along. I've done this journey now. I don't know that I would do it again. Now I would love to be in a business that doesn't need as much capital and generates cash flows earlier, where you do genuinely, keep more control and maybe, have a few family offices invest in the early stages, but then never raise money again and so forth. But not every company can do that. Most enterprise software businesses, particularly software as a service, rather than perpetual licenses, you lose money for years and years and years, particularly if you're growing fast. In fact, the faster you grow, the more money you lose. Yeah. Because your payback periods are 1 to 2 years. And so if you're going to start that kind of business, then I think that the only way to really reach scale is to raise institutional capital. There's very few. I mean, there are some exceptions, and man, I tip my hat to them for the ones that somehow figured out to turn cash flow positive in their first 12 to 18 months and then just be off to the races. But that's exceedingly rare.
It seems like it's slightly more often in B2B than it is in consumer. But still super hard to build out the product. How did you so kind of switching tack from investment for a little bit? You got some money in, you raised early, so and you hired your first key hire, this CTO from Salesforce. So then how did you think about culture and like maintaining culture as you were scaling up the organization? How did you focus on hiring in the early days?
We focused on it quite a lot, and I would say it was the biggest struggle I think that we had, as a founding team. Marco and I were certainly coming in, I would say less so with a very clear vision of what we wanted to create, but with a lot more clarity on what we didn't want to be, coming from various other employers that we'd had. And so we were definitely reacting against certain kind of like big organization and other cultures that we just didn't want to emulate. We also saw in real practical ways that if we just had a typical software company culture, that it wouldn't resonate with hoteliers. And in fact, I can't think of a single really successful software company in the hotel space that was built by people that were completely outside of the hotel business. You needed people around the table in those early days, usually as a founder, or as a super early employee with a lot of influence, who really lives and breathes the hospitality industry. There's just a different way of speaking and treating people and doing business in the hotel industry, which frankly can be pretty frustrating, but is also really wonderful. And so we, from the very beginning, have had in mind of melding a hospitality culture with a software culture. And I would say in the early days, we really over-indexed, well, maybe not over, but we indexed very highly on the hotel side. And frankly, we did get to a point, though, as we were scaling the business, where if most of your department heads or division heads are former hotel managers or executives, and they're trying to learn the software business, sometimes it doesn't work. There is value to people who have spent their entire careers thinking about selling software, marketing software, supporting software customers and so on. And it is a very difficult balance to strike. Now, I also don't mean to be vilifying kind of a software culture. I mean, these are very nice people. If you interview for that and you fire and promote with that in mind, which I think we historically did do, I think that there were a number of people who were star performers their whole lives who came into Duetto and were really shocked within 60 to 90 days to lose their job over how they're treating people. And we did it over and over again. And I think it was really critical to maintaining a culture. I think that's by far the most important way to influence culture, is who you hire, fire, and promote. And we were always willing to overlook a candidate in a recruiting process who seemed like they, might be an asshole, or then to, really promote people that were a good fit and counsel people out of the business who aren't. And in many cases, I think those people who left are happier for it because they knew they weren't a fit. It's just the trauma of, being told that, but then they went on to do great things after Duetto. And so I would say that this is the area where we clashed a lot with investors because they just didn't get it. And to some extent, I think the company has now swung pretty far back in the other direction. And I think it'll be interesting to watch how the industry responds, to a company that is now, very much a growth software company and less so a hospitality business. And so, it's hard to know ever what the right answers are, but it's been an interesting journey.
Yeah. How did, just the way, as I'm thinking about this, it's kind of like the journey for entrepreneurs that are founding companies, and then you start and you build your early stage team. And then did you find some of the stories that I've read and heard, people felt like their job was constantly changing, and also like the way that you needed to communicate with early stage employees changed as you scaled up the company? So was that a priority for you guys as you grew the number of staff? How did your job change over time?
It changed radically. I mean, that's some of what I liked most about it. In my kind of circuitous route through my career, one might observe that maybe I get bored with things pretty easily. And I certainly never got bored at Duetto because the challenges were, it seemed, maybe not every quarter, but certainly more often than once a year. It felt like the challenges were pretty novel, pretty new. And communication was very different. I mean, I think that's a really insightful question. In the early days, I think one of the styles of leadership that I was really trying to develop was just a lot more transparency than I had ever experienced before, including transparency about how I was doing, like how I being transparent with employees around my own fears for the future, and, being really transparent about how we were doing in a fundraising, and sometimes things would go off the rails. And I think most of those early employees, they thrived on that. I mean, it was one of the reasons why so many, several young, people right out of university who joined us, they stayed for years when their instinct was to go start their own businesses. Because I think that they really did. They say that they felt like a real part of it. And then now some of them moved on and started their own businesses. And I did learn, though, that as the company grew and as we hired people that were much more people who do a specific job, they weren't accustomed to it, and they were not comfortable with it. They did not thrive in an environment where the CEO would be really transparent about, my own sort of demons and and the vicissitudes of the business. They preferred to just know, is my paycheck going to be there? Is the company going to continue to exist for the next 6 months to a year? And give me the vision. The other way that the communication changed, which frankly I think I failed at to a large extent, is that it became much more about just repeating over and over and over again. Here's the vision. Here's our focus. Here's our focus. Here's our focus. And I find that to be boring. And so my instincts were to get pulled into deals, and to work on partnerships, and to dive into problems with existing customers, and to not be just repeating the same thing over and over and over and over again every day. And frankly, I think that the organization in some ways suffered because of my resistance to becoming, that kind of a CEO. And I never know what it means, because I think it can mean a lot of different things in terms of why a founder CEO isn't scaling. But I think that must be at least one of the causes. Now, I was coached on this literally by executive coaches and by board members and so forth. And when I started to adopt some of these things, the company performance improved. I was doing it effectively, but I was miserable. And so it became a bit of a mystery to my board in particular, when we have multiple quarters of great performance of the company. People seem to be really responding to my leadership. And then I raise my hand and say, I'd really like to promote one of our executives to be the CEO, and I'd rather, move into a chairman role, because I'm not feeling it anymore. I see the evidence that this is what the company needs, and I see that I'm able to do it.
Yeah.
But I'm also really clear that I don't want to. And that was an unpleasant series of conversations to have with the board.
Do you think that that's because anyone that wants to do something entrepreneurial or be a change maker, have an effect in the world, often you're also quite curious and don't want to have that repetition that maybe people that work in executive roles and they've been brought up through the management class of organizations, they maybe want to have that stability of just maintaining the ship, and maybe that the thing that got you to build the company in the first place might have been the thing that didn't make you quite so good at the job in running it later on.
Yeah, so I think there absolutely is a temperament aspect to it. And I think the type of curiosity matters, right? So I'm loving being challenged by brand new things. People that know me well know that I've got a wide range of different interests and things that I choose to be passionate about. And I apply that to business as well. I do think that executives that succeed in moving up in instituting, processes and procedures and controls and so forth, to do it well, they also have to be curious, but they have to be curious about different things. And so if you're really curious about what makes a process highly repeatable, where a low skilled worker or somebody who's new can just scale up really quickly because there's structure and they just get it, and to be able to just create accountability systems that just work, whether that's the metrics you track and how you set targets and compensation schemes. If that's what you're fascinated by, then you thrive in that. Mm-hmm. I'm fascinated by it long enough to understand it and to be able to talk about it intelligently, but then not so fascinated that I want to fine tune it week after week after week. But the person that created the Toyota production system that really changed modern manufacturing, I think that's probably a pretty darn curious person, but they're curious about things that I would find to be pretty miserable to dig into every day.
That's quite interesting, because the way, on social media and on Instagram, you're traveling around hotels and things. And something I noticed was that you're very specific about maybe reviewing products or reviewing rooms and being interested in the choices that have been made by the service provider or the person who's made that product. And I thought that maybe that would have been driven into product development for the technology, and having like focus on really trying to make sure that everything was perfect. But but then you were talking about you being more on the commercial side, and having more of an interest in speaking to clients and things. So between you and Marco, who was more the product focus, and who was more working on the commercial side? How did you guys think about splitting up responsibilities in that?
Product was definitely always Marco. Right. He knows more than I'll ever know about the fields of revenue strategy and marketing of hotels. I certainly knew enough to be dangerous. And I think that one of the reasons why I was so indispensable on the road for so long is that I could translate so that it didn't feel like a sales meeting where they felt like they were talking to somebody who actually knew what they were talking about. I had done the job at Wynn. I had weathered the storm during the, financial crisis of 2008, 2009 timeframe. I'd helped open a 2,750 room hotel during that madness. And so I was detail oriented enough and could go, pretty geeky, up to almost the limit of almost anyone in the industry aside from Marco. And so, again, it allowed me to get into the details, and I really love the details, and I love thinking about experiences. So like, I was always very curious about both the product and the service delivery in terms of how we trained people, how we onboarded them, how they use the product on an ongoing basis, and so forth. And so that was one of the great joys of, building the company. Mm-hmm. But I would never step on Marco's toes. That he was the product visionary, and just goes a level of depth vastly deeper than I ever will.
Got it. So then I was kind of starting to think, given that you've stepped away a little bit from Duetto and you've got, a lot of other interests going on, I was just, interested in what you're spending your time on at the moment, and what plates are you spinning, and how are you managing to balance your time between quite a range of different things now?
I'm not sure it's well balanced. I'm not sure. I was pretty far along at looking at some tourism development projects, which are still moving, but are moving more slowly, given what's going on in the world right now. I'm working on a membership concept that I think is still very viable in this age, that's related to the yachting industry. But I also think that kind of some core things around the yachting business need to be stabilized again because of the times we're in, before you can really then build a business on top of that. And people aren't really able to travel right now. So, and we don't know when they'll be able to, so it's hard to be selling these memberships during this time period. And then frankly, I'm considering going back into the government. This will be the first time I've talked about it in any public way. I feel a strong desire to serve, and I am in a moment where, because some of my entrepreneurial ventures are kind of necessarily on hold, I feel like it's a time where, if people are able to, that it's a great time to serve. And so I'm looking to see whether or not there's a viable opportunity to, go into government, for instance. And hopefully I'll know in the next couple of weeks whether or not that is an opportunity, and I'd be excited to do it if I could. And then also looking at ways to be involved in, kind of directly fighting COVID. So working with a friend of mine who has a, surface, protectant that is industry leading, that's been very effective in healthcare and in transit, and helping them think about expanding into the hotel industry, which I think, will need new, sanitation protocols and so forth, where this product can be hugely beneficial. And so in the last week, I've probably spent 60 hours, ramping up on that business and communicating with hoteliers about this product that is pretty new to the hotel industry, but I think could have a profoundly positive impact on those companies as well as their guests.
Nice. This is I think this has been incredible, Patrick. I really enjoyed catching up with you, and it's been too long since we caught up in New York.
I know, it has been.
And
I'm really grateful you reached out.
No worries. And it's been I don't think we had the opportunity to fully kind of dive into some of your background when we met, and I'm grateful that we've had this opportunity, and thanks for spending the time.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Well, I guess that's the end of the show. So thanks very much for watching, everyone. And thank you, Patrick.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.